Hi everyone, this is German World War II Archive, and I hope you're all doing well. If you've subscribed to my channel and are watching this video, you're most likely familiar with the German Newsweek, the unified weekly propaganda newsreel of Nazi Germany that ran from July 1940, when all the other newsreels were unified into one, until March 1945. With over 280 wartime episodes produced, and almost all of them having survived, they account for much of the German wartime footage, and footage from the Newsweek is regularly used in documentaries, video games, and other media works about Nazi Germany and World War II. But this also means there are some misconceptions about it, and one misconception in particular that I often encounter is that people believe that the Germans got their news from the Newsweek, which they did not. The German Newsweek, and this is in fact a phenomenon that can be applied to almost any newsreel, propaganda or not, was not the primary source of information for Germans. It also wasn't the second or third source of information. In fact, I would go as far as saying that for many Germans, it wasn't a source of information or news at all. And it was never meant to be that. This misconception that people got their news from the German Newsweek is something that comes from the way we nowadays get our news. When we watch the news on TV or read a news page on the internet, it is often for this exact purpose, to learn what's new, to get the latest information and development from our region, our country, and the world. And then it's easy to assume that people did the same thing back then with the newsreels. But the problem is that newsreels were usually outdated, at least by a few days, when they got released. They couldn't feature latest developments because of the way they were produced. The footage taken, be it by civilian cameramen or German propaganda soldiers, had to be physically brought back to the production center of the UFA company in Berlin. All media back then was analog. There was no way to transfer footage digitally. The actual physical film rolls had to be brought into the studio for editing. Now, while this is easy enough for footage filmed within Germany, and indeed sometimes planned events in Berlin, like a state funeral, could be featured only a day or two afterwards in the German Newsweek, this gets a bit tricky for footage from faraway combat zones. First of all, a German propaganda cameraman somewhere on the Eastern Front would film for a few days, sometimes even a few weeks before sending the footage back. It's not like today, where we can send individual videos or clips to someone. If a propaganda cameraman tried to send back a film roll containing exactly one scene, 1 minute of footage, out of which after editing maybe 10 seconds are usable, his superiors would probably get quite angry at him for wasting transport capacities like this. Instead, he would film several rolls, several minutes of footage before sending it back, so the process of taking the footage alone could take several days or weeks before it was even making its way back to Germany. And this journey would also take several days. It would probably be sent from the front lines via truck to a railway station, and from there via train back to Germany, or maybe, if these were available, they were flown back to Germany via transport plane. And if a cameraman was accompanying a U-boat on a combat patrol, well, then the footage could obviously only arrive after the U-boat returned to port, meaning it would be weeks, sometimes months old at this point. What that meant is that the footage would, at the very least, be a few days old before it even arrives at the studio, sometimes weeks or even months, meaning most of the footage shown in the German Newsweek, especially combat footage thousands of kilometers away from Germany, was at least a few weeks old. It would be like turning on the TV today and seeing new developments from 2 weeks ago, which is hardly news at that point. Another thing to keep in mind is that the Newsweek ran for an entire week, until the next episode came out. So things that were still news by Monday were hardly news anymore by Friday, yet obviously the German Newsweek didn't change throughout the week. I recently uploaded the German Newsweek number 564 on this channel, which was released on June 25th, 1941, 3 days after the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Many people in the comments were surprised that the first thing shown in this newsreel was not the German invasion of the Soviet Union, but instead footage of the final game of the 1941 German football championship between Schalke 04 and Rapid Wien, and the German invasion of the Soviet Union is only shown in the second half of the newsreel. And this was mainly because everyone already knew about it. Everyone had heard the big news on the morning of June 22nd, either through radio or newspaper. The reality of the war against the Soviet Union had mostly settled in by June 25th, and there was no reason to put it right at the start of the newsreel. There were also some other reasons, mainly that for many Germans the news of the invasion came as a shock and they were not particularly happy about it, so it was somewhat hidden in the latter part of the newsreel. But if the newsreels were not the primary source of information, how did people actually get their news? Well, mostly from the newspaper. In the 1930s and 40s, everyone read the newspaper. Depending on what you were doing and your education level, you would at least probably read one newspaper a day, usually at breakfast or during your lunch break. This was done by all classes and professions. An educated professor would probably read more newspapers than the simple factory workers, but everyone would read at least one. And newspapers, since they came out new every day, could indeed report quickly on new developments throughout the country and world, especially since news agencies could broadcast developments from halfway across the world via telegram, and often news from the other side of the world, for example the US or South America, were already printed in German newspapers the next morning. Because unlike film rolls, sound could indeed be transmitted rather quickly throughout the world, either by undersea telegram cables, long-range phone calls, or teleprinters. Before World War II, it was very possible to send a telegram from the US to Germany and have it arrive only a few hours later. An even faster method of getting news was the radio. Although having a radio at home was still somewhat uncommon because these things were pretty expensive back then, but most people had a chance to listen to the radio on a daily basis. For example, most factories had a radio in the break room or on the assembly line, and the Nazis tried to get as many radios to factories and private homes as possible. And then, another source of information, although not really official, were rumors and stories told by neighbors, friends, and acquaintances, or from foreign radio, like the German service of the BBC, which a lot of people listened to despite it being officially illegally in Nazi Germany. And especially in a dictatorship where everyone knew the media was censored, these kinds of unofficial channels often became the kind of information people were the most interested in. But if not for the news, why did people watch the newsreel? Nazi Germany is probably a bad example for this, because newsreel screening was mandatory in cinemas, so people didn't really have a choice. But even in countries where newsreel screening was not mandatory, people still regularly watched them. The main reason why was for the images. People were already used to seeing pictures, and owning a camera was not all that impressive anymore by the 1930s. Even people who couldn't afford a camera still had their picture taken for a family photo or something. But moving images, video, was completely different. It's one thing to see a picture of a soldier in the newspaper, but seeing soldiers actually marching and fighting, real footage from the front lines, was still something worth going to the cinema for, even if you were already familiar with the context of the news. And this holds still today. People still watch videos from events despite that they already know exactly what happened. But the visualization of an event is still far more interesting than simply reading about it. That's a fairly common concept. It's one thing to read about something, but it's an entire different thing to watch footage from it. And people are usually more impressed by moving images than they are by a mere textual description of an event. Another thing was sound. While movies had become somewhat common by the 1930s and 40s, sound movies were still something different. The very first feature-length movie in the world to feature both music and speech was an American movie called The Jazz Singer, produced by Warner Bros. And released in October 1927. The very first German sound movie was a movie called Melody of Hearts, released by the UFA in November 1929. The very first sound newsreel in Germany was the UFA Tonwoche, broadcasted for the first time in 1930. So the combination of moving images plus sound was also fairly new for most people, another reason to watch the newsreels. I think it is hard to grasp for us nowadays how amazing this must have been for people back then to be able to see moving images with sounds of events that happened hundreds or thousands of kilometers away, which is also the main answer for the question why people watch these newsreels. I hope this video helped clarify a few things about the German Newsweek and newsreels in general, and cleared up some misconceptions regarding the concept. That's all for today. I hope you have a great January, and see you soon.